Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
Welcome. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We launched this series a couple of weeks ago to engage our extended USC Dornsife community in a series of dialogues with our experts about various issues that so many of us are thinking about these days. Academics and public health officials have warned us for years about the likelihood of a major pandemic, but it turns out we were still caught pretty off guard when this one struck. Today, we're going to explore some of the reasons why we as a nation weren't better prepared when the coronavirus hit us, and hopefully gain some insights about how we might do better next time. So let's get on with it. I have the pleasure to introduce you to Mark Perry, who's going to lead our discussion. Mark Perry is an acclaimed writer, historian, and foreign affairs analyst. He's authored 10 books, many of which go deep into the lives and the minds of American leaders. He's an award-winning journalist, and his articles have been featured in publications including the LA Times, the Washington Post, Politico, the American Conservative, and many others. Perry is the former co-director of the Conflicts Forum, and he's also served as a senior foreign policy analyst for the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation. You might recognize him not only by his byline, but also from the screen. He's often seen providing commentary and expertise for news outlets like Al Jazeera Television and CNN. And now he can add Dornsife Dialogues to that impressive resume. Please welcome Mark Perry.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful intro and I appreciate it. Please allow me to introduce our two panelists today for our discussion. First is Andy Lakoff, who's a professor of sociology and the divisional dean of social sciences at USC Dornsife, and the author of Unprepared: Global Health in a Time of Emergency, in which he describes the challenges of properly anticipating and preparing for biological threats. Also joining us is Nils Gilman, who previously worked as Associate Chancellor at the University of California, Berkeley, and as Research Director and Scenario Planning Consultant at the Monitor Group and Global Business Network. Welcome to you both. It's great to be here. I'm coming to you from Arlington, Virginia, where it's a beautiful day. I hope it's beautiful where you are. Let's start. My first question, I think, to introduce this subject is for Andy Lakoff. In 2001, as I reported in Foreign Policy article recently, there was a simulation of a pandemic outbreak in the United States. And what that simulation showed is that there would be a surge in hospitals, there would be deep political disaffection, lockdowns wouldn't be obeyed, there would be real medical problems that we'd be facing. There'd be a spread of misinformation and disinformation. This was in 2001, nearly 20 years ago. So we should have been prepared, and maybe we were. My question for you is, why were we taken by surprise?
So it's a great question. As you say, US officials, health experts, and others have been warning us for over 2 decades that we were due for some kind of disease emergency, whether it was a bioterrorist attack, which is what was simulated in Dark Winter, an outbreak of bird flu. There was a lot of concern about that in the early 2000s, or something else that we might not expect. And for 20 years, we've been engaged in exercises like Dark Winter, making plans, developing scenarios, stockpiling countermeasures. In fact, the US, up until last year, was seen around the world as the most prepared country in the world. A think tank put together a list of which countries were most prepared for some kind of major biological catastrophe, and the US ranked first in the world on that. So you end up with a puzzle. Why has our response been so seemingly disorganized? Why were we caught off guard? I think there's a few hypotheses we might advance. One is that when we were talking about preparedness over the last 2 decades, we actually weren't necessarily looking at everything we should have been looking at. We were looking at early detection systems, at certain kinds of medical response capabilities, but we might not have been thinking about a broader picture of competent governmental leadership, response capacity that was flexible, attentive to alerts. We may have been preparing for the wrong things. We may have spent too much time thinking about a bioterrorist attack and not enough time thinking about a new type of emerging disease for which there were no medical countermeasures like drugs or vaccines available. And arguably, preparedness maybe isn't even the right question. We need to be thinking much more broadly about our public health system's readiness for everyday problems as well as novel and emerging threats. So I think we're going to be assessing this for the next months and even years.
Nils, let me turn to you. In preparation for our dialogue today, I went onto your Twitter feed, and one of the things you said really struck me because I happen to agree with it. When you said, what we're seeing today is the party of science versus the party of magical thinking, which I thought was exactly right. As I said in an article I wrote for the American Conservative on the pandemic, the division in America seems now, during the pandemic, to not be red versus blue or Democrat or Republican or conservative or liberal, but people who believe in science and people who don't. Do you think that's an exaggeration, or do you think it's accurate?
I do think there are people who believe in science is a particularly loaded term, right? Let's say put faith in scientists, and people who are skeptical of scientists is probably the more accurate way of putting it. I should say that when I made that tweet, I was actually specifically reflecting on a conversation I had with a friend in Britain who talked about how the division between the Remainers and the Leavers had reconfigured around the response to the coronavirus, where in Britain, one faction has become very intent on reopening as quickly as possible, closing borders but reopening the economy, and the other faction has said, no, we need to defer to the scientists who say that we need to, the epidemiologists who say that we need to close up shop for longer in order to protect the public's and the public health. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, it was the Brexiteer faction within the British polity that was more in favor of closing borders and opening the economy, and it was the Remain faction that was more inclined to defer to the experts. So I think the real question is a division between people who defer to expertise and people who don't defer to expertise and prefer to rely on other kinds of, shall we say, epistemologies or rationalities for thinking about how we address public policy concerns.
It's interesting because in the midst of this pandemic, we've kind of torn the scab off of all kinds of political questions. Globalizations versus building borders. You just mentioned the reliance on expertise versus the non-reliance on expertise. I think that people really want immediate answers, and those are hard to come by. The analogy I come up with is, if I'm sitting here in Virginia and there's an earthquake, I can go next door and ask the guy next door, what the hell happened? He can say, well, I was originally from California. I've been through an earthquake. Don't worry, it's an earthquake. And I can go across the street to a guy who's got a shortwave radio and he can give me the latest news. But during a pandemic, where do I go? Who's the experts? Should we believe them? I was reading this morning that we've got perhaps a treatment. Other scientists say, no, we don't have a treatment. How do we sort through, Nils, I'm asking you, how do we sort through good information from bad information in the middle of what's a global crisis?
So let me cut at that in a couple of different ways. One is that, I think you're making an astute point that how do people know what they think they know, right? There's basically three ways that people come to understand the world. One is through direct experience, right? You can go outside on the street and see things. Another one is by relying on some kind of an expert, whether that's a government statistical agency or a scientist or a doctor or an earthquake specialist or what have you. And the third way is to rely on opinion leaders, as they say, the media. And I think that there's been a growth and distrust in expertise, and this has been documented by many people over the last few years, where the kinds of organizations, entities, and individuals who used to have the status, the warrant to speak with authority on things, are increasingly doubted by larger and larger segments of the public. And they instead prefer to rely on their own personal experience, make their own judgments about things, or rely on other kinds of opinion for leaders, whether it's Fox News or the president or Alex Jones or what have you. So people choose different kinds of places to go for information in these circumstances. And the reality is that I suppose all of us are inclined to go to information sources that confirm our own biases in one way or another. And the fact that we've broken up a common informational sphere into all these different informational silos makes it very easy for all of us to forum shop for the information source that's going to allow us to continue to believe the things we already believe. And so I think it just has continued the fragmentation of our collective understanding of reality.
Andy, playing off what Nils just said in the fragmentation, here we are in the middle of a pandemic. Hopefully we're kind of on the down slope of it. Maybe despite the simulations that should have prepared us but didn't, is it possible now to kind of begin the planning for the next one, to be more prepared? Or are we always going to be faced with some kind of black swan event that we think we're going to be able to get under control, and it's going to instead teach us of our own fallibilities?
Let me step back and make one comment that I think is related to this about the role of expertise in an emergency. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the scientists themselves are operating under conditions of extreme uncertainty. It's, the analogy would be the fog of war. The virologists, epidemiologists still don't know definitively the rate of infection, the case fatality ratio for this disease, whether in fact immunity is conferred through exposure. There's a lot of different epidemiological models being put out there, and some of them are in conflict. So I think that when you talk about the public's reception of expertise, it's important to understand the public is getting a lot of different versions of what the truth is, even from the experts. So all that is to say that in the middle of an emergency like this, a pandemic, we can't rely on the long-term process of scientific peer review, experimental confirmation, and so on to tell us what to do. So we're faced with using pre-existing plans or using our existing conceptual frameworks to address an emergency. I think the lessons that we're going to learn from this one have to do with how the importance of good governance as opposed to having made plans 5 years ago, 10 years ago. At the very moment of the outset of an emergency, you need to put those plans into motion, and you need public trust in the leaders who are putting those plans into action.
Can I just go on that for 1 second?
Yeah.
Dwight Eisenhower, who was perhaps the greatest planner that we ever had as president, obviously organized the invasion of Europe during World War II, and then ran a big university, and then eventually became president of the United States. He has a famous line. He said, "Plans are worthless, but planning is everything." And what he meant by that was that what the process of planning allows you to do is to exercise, as it were, the organizational and institutional muscles, so that when the crisis happens, which is never going to be exactly what you were able to anticipate, you already have in place a set of procedures and mechanisms for reacting in real time. I think if you look across the world today, there's been highly divergent effectivenesses in terms of the response of policymakers and the communities that they serve in terms of abating the progress of the virus. And one of the factors I think that's quite decisive in that is, we talked about expertise already, but I think just as important is actually the institutionalization of practicing and thinking through what the kinds of challenges that you may face, doing exercises where all the people who will be involved in having to deal with the responses are, expected to participate, so that when the crisis unfolds, you already have practiced before. For the same reason that you don't just put on a play without ever doing a rehearsal. Doing rehearsals, they're not the same thing as a live performance, but they ensure that when you have to do the live performance, you're going to be better prepared to put on a good show.
It's interesting, in thinking about this over the last 24 hours, and my experience comes from covering the US government, covering the military in particular. And I can remember a conversation I had many years ago now with Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense. And I had been covering the Pentagon for a while, and I was talking to him, and he said to me, "Well, Mark, what surprises you most about the Pentagon? What is it that you don't like about the Pentagon?" And I said, I said, nothing ever gets done. And he looked at me and said, well, you're a good progressive. What do you want us to do? And I said, well, actually nothing. And he said, well, that's exactly what we're going to do. And this kind of anecdote keeps coming back to me because we expect our government to be very deliberate, very careful in its response, to take its time to assess threats, to only call on the people when absolutely necessary. And yet here we are in the middle of the pandemic, and we absolutely require our government to be on top of it all the time, to react quickly and to be decisive when we've actually created a form of government that cuts against that. So my question, I think, for both of you is very political. You know, if we want a government to act decisively, we also want a government that's going to be intrusive into our life, that's going to manage a pandemic crisis by doing what South Korea does. They're on their cell phones. How much is too much? What should we expect?
I mean, I'm not certain that there isn't a distinctive form of emergency preparedness that could be much more effective, that is complementary to American norms and suspicion of too much government intrusion. And in fact, Nils referred to Eisenhower, and during the Eisenhower administration, a template was put in place that involved the federal government playing a fairly circumscribed coordinative role during what was then the ultimate emergency, which would have been a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. And it involved integrating actors across the federal government, states, and localities. And it was not a totalitarian model of an intrusive state. And we've seen examples of that in the past in successful emergency responses in the US. The problem really is that the folks now in the federal government did not practice that, did not work on that, did not think through, who are the governors they're going to have to talk to? How are they going to have to work on distributing supplies to the places that are needed? And that's the muscle memory that Nils is talking about, why you do exercises. So the system of emergency preparedness that we have in place actually is specifically addressed to keep us from falling into the kind of totalitarian society that Mark, I think you're alluding to.
I mean, I agree with that, Andy, but let me try to push you on it just a little bit, which is that I do think that government capacity isn't just about practicing. It's also partly about, having the habit of, as Mark said, making various kinds of intrusions into civil society. When you have that kind of intrusiveness, that's part of what the practice is. How do you interact with the public in an effective way? I do think the fact that, Americans, in general, and particularly, people on the right in this country in recent years have been very skeptical of the government having these kinds of powers. And they've intentionally tried to shrink the size of government until it's small enough to drown in a bathtub, to use the phrase of one well-known right-wing ideologue on this topic. And if you do that, that has certain advantages. It affords you in normal times, more freedom. But then, when the crisis comes, you're not going to be ready if you've done that to the government. So I do think that that's a choice that, we've made as a society to move down a path towards more libertarian, smaller, less high capacity government for all sorts of reasons. And, that means that when a big crisis that requires a government that has had practice coordinating complicated responses, when that moment comes, you're just not going to have that kind of a government. I don't think it's a surprise when you look at the countries that have been most successful in tamping down the outbreaks of the pandemic. The divisions are not between democracies and authoritarian regimes, right? I mean, obviously China had a very bad outbreak. I don't think they've been forthright about how bad it was. I think it was worse than they probably let on. But then they did, through draconian measures, manage to largely suppress any further propagation, if we believe the statistics. But certainly, given what we're seeing about the reopening of the economy in China, it does appear that they have, at least gotten it more under control. But it's not just in China, right? It's also South Korea, as Mark was mentioning. I think the poster child is actually Taiwan. Taiwan's first case took place on the same day the U.S. had its first case, which was January 20th. Since then, they've had 429 total cases and 6 deaths, compared to the US having now over 1 million cases and some 60,000 deaths so far. Taiwan's a democracy. South Korea is a democracy. They have a different set of values, and one of the things they have is, these are societies where, because they're in difficult neighborhoods for all sorts of reasons, have always had a much more mobilized population with respect to the government. So, for example, there's universal conscription into the military in both Taiwan and South Korea. The idea that the government can literally just take a year of your life and put you in the military is an understood thing that everybody accepts as part of the culture. We don't have that in this country. We haven't had, there's a draft, but we haven't actually exercised that function. There's no universal conscription for the last half century. We don't have a culture in this country that really supports that kind of intrusive government. And, people will feel differently about how good of an idea it is to be that way.
I mean, I think you can distinguish between competent government and intrusive government. Let's take the German model as the kind of European poster child for what seems to be a much more successful, coherent response to this. And I don't think it's the same model as the South Korean model, but I do think you have a lot of public trust in government. I think you have a lot of health capacity. You have a lot of surge capacity, available ICU beds, a strong health system. All those things made it possible for Germany to have a resilient response to this, I think, without a lot of the kind of intrusiveness that we're worried about when we look at some of the countries like South Korea.
I agree with that. I think that maybe the most important variable is actually trust in government. If you look at the countries that have had the most difficult responses, Italy, United States, Spain, these are countries that are ruled by very different kinds of governments right now, but what they all have in common is a pretty deep distrust in government. Whereas the countries that have responded really well, Germany, South Korea, Taiwan, China, the people, for better or worse, do have trust in their government officials and are willing to abide by what the government officials do. The one thing I might push back on a little bit, Andy, is that I think the relationship between intrusive government and competent government is perhaps a little bit they're not totally uncorrelated things, right? Part of the issue is whether people trust the government to make the right kinds of intrusions and whether governments have performed reasonably well when they have made intrusions. And I think there's good historical reasons why, in the case of the United States or in the case of Italy, just to take two examples, people have a lot of skepticism about whether, when the government actually does make interventions, whether they're successful.
I guess I would just say when we try to diagnose what went wrong, and obviously we're going to have to do this for over the next months and years, we may look less at whether the public in the United States trusted government and more at whether our own federal government trusted its own experts and leaders in guiding the response. So, what the strange phenomenon that we had in the United States was a federal government that didn't itself believe or trust the plans that prior administrations had put in place to prepare for this.
Before we go to questions, and we have a whole slew of them, not surprisingly, let me just add a little spice to this. I noticed on Twitter, not all my information comes from Twitter, by the way, but I noticed on Twitter the other day somebody saying, well, if this is a war, we could fight it like we fight the insurgencies in the Middle East. And I thought immediately, well, if we fight it like we fight the insurgencies in the Middle East, we're going to lose. So, there's a reason for lack of trust in government. The one thing that the United States should be good at, we spend a lot of money on it, we spend a lot of time training our experts. The one thing that we should be good at is war. We haven't been very good. So we're not good at that. And the military is among the most trusted institutions in the United States. There's no wonder there's mistrust in government. And it'll be interesting to see whether at the end of all this, which I'll get to in a second, at the end of all this, there is a growing trust in the government if we handle this correctly. So before we go to Q&A, let me ask a broad question of both of you, because I think our audience is very interested in this. And I'll quote a general, since we're talking about generals. I'll quote David Petraeus. Tell me how this ends. Nils, let's start with you. How does it end? Can you see an end?
Well, I can see there's a variety of possible ends. Let me just make one point, which I think addresses a couple of the questions that have come up in the question and answer box. if you look at the public opinion polls in the United States and ask them about how the government has responded, they're pretty negative on the federal government response. There's some partisan differences on that, but there's a pretty broad negative view of how the federal government has performed during this pandemic. On the other hand, in most states, the popularity of the governors in those states, who after all have sort of first line responsibility for managing public health in their states, has generally been very positive. There's a couple of exceptions. There's been quite a bit of negativity, I think, in Florida towards Governor DeSantis there. But across the country, for the most part, people have approved of the way in which their governors have performed, and it's, again, not a partisan issue. People are very positive on Governor Newsom here in California. Cuomo in New York has become a bit of a national star, but it's also Mike DeWine in Ohio, I think, has been given very high marks for his performance in handling this. And so I think one answer is going to be that different states are going to come out of this, just focused on the United States, at different rates depending on the particular course of the pandemic in their state and the kinds of decisions that the political leaders at the state level are going to make. Part of the dereliction of the effectiveness of the federal government in this country, part of what that means is that really the decisions are going to come down to state level choices. In terms of how it's going to go, there's so many uncertainties right now, both at an empirical level, as Andy was referring to. We don't know what the even now today what the transmission rates are, what the case fatality rates are. There's all sorts of mysteries about how many people have actually been infected, how many people have actually how many asymptomatic carriers they are. All of those things speak to the fact that we don't know whether what appears to be a flattening of the curve now is that a result of the successful, lockdown measures that have been put in place? Is it partly a matter of seasonality of the virus? Different states are going to open up at different rates. Will we see recurrences or future spikes, more waves? Will there be seasonality to this so that we see that there's going to be perhaps, a second big wave of infections next winter? Will it become an endemic disease where we'll start, we talk about cold and flu season. Maybe we're going to start talking about cold, flu, and COVID season as just a regular part of what we have to live with. I think inevitably, whatever those outcomes are, over time, we're going to, figure out, how to live with this virus. But I don't think it's likely that we're going to live with in the same way after this is over or after it becomes normalized. I think that there's going to be some long-term changes to the way we interact with each other, the way we gather in groups, the way we segregate different parts of the population from one another, particularly the old and the vulnerable. I think these things are likely to be permanent changes that are not going to be just temporary things that we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I agree with what Nils said. The one thing I would add to that is just that it may not be clearly bounded when the pandemic ends. We may have to figure out a new type of normalcy. I think there's a lot of hope out there that something like herd immunity will lead to the end of the pandemic, or the introduction of a vaccine. But there are just too many uncertainties right now to know what the end would look like. So I think, as Nils said, there's a range of scenarios.
Under quarantine here in Arlington, Virginia, I want to thank you both, Andy and Nils, for your expertise and your insights. I want to thank the audience for all their questions, for tuning in with us. If you've missed this or want to replay it, you can do it. Wednesday's Dornsife Dialogue, today's Dornsife Dialogue will be up and on the website. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you to our panelists. Good discussion.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcast.usc.edu.